Good evening, friends. Welcome, listeners one and all. I am your host, GM Danielson, and what a wild ride awaits you, friends. Within lie all sorts of things about Halloween. Stories of evil pumpkins, scarecrows that may be a bit more than straw and wood, true stalker stories that happened on Halloween, tales of vampires and their sworn enemies, werewolves. So listen on, friends, have a lovely October, and happy Halloween. I sat quietly by the door with a shotgun in hand. Halloween had just arrived, and I anxiously awaited the yearly session of Trick or Treat. As always, I turned off all the lights, boarded up the windows, and removed any door signs. It usually did the trick, yet I was on edge. My only window into the outside world was through a tiny peephole in the door. It was enough to witness the hundreds of tiny creatures walking around the street, all dressed up in various disfigured costumes. "You'd better stay the hell away from me," I mumbled to myself. Should any of the horrific small monsters approach my door, I was ready to pull the trigger. Still, that would only provide me a minuscule opportunity to escape. There were simply too many of them, more arriving by each passing year. My best bet would be to remain quiet. One costume child in particular caught my attention. It was a little faceless creature. I pondered how it would even eat without a mouth, a question that I was quickly answered as its abdomen tore open, revealing rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth. I shivered as my eyes wandered to the next mangled monstrosity. An armless, headless creature dragging itself across the ground with dark tendrils. But something else existed among the hellscape before me. Something moving differently from all other things. A kid. For reasons I cannot comprehend, a child had ventured into the broken world of Halloween, futilely trying to escape. He wasn't screaming, nor calling out for help. He was simply trying to get away. I just sat there in awe for a few seconds, trying to process the reality of what I was witnessing. My first thought was that it had to be a trick. Then he tripped. With that, something deep within me awoke, an instinct I hadn't felt in years. Without hesitation, I barged out through the front door. The kid wasn't far away, just across the street, but I had absolutely no confidence that either of us would make it back inside alive. Still, I had to try. I ran through the masked figures, each of them looking like children dressed in creative Halloween costumes. Within a few seconds, I made it to the kid. Before I could pull him up, one of the creatures lunged at us, ready to strike. I pulled up my shotgun and pulled the trigger. Its head, which looked oddly similar to Mickey Mouse, blew open. The creature fell to the ground, but it still wasn't dead. It just lay there, dragging itself around, trying to grasp onto us. Before another one got the chance to strike, I pulled the young boy up from the ground, and we retreated back inside my house. We'd escaped, but it had come at the cost of my hideout. They knew we were inside, and it wouldn't take them long to break through the door. "Why the hell did you go out there?" I asked.
We were going home for curfew, but the monsters came earlier this year,"
the boy cried. He couldn't have been older than 10 and wasn't in particularly good shape. "Where are your parents?" he just cried.
"They're dead. The monsters killed them."
They were already hammering on my door, desperately trying to break through. Despite their childlike appearance, they were unfathomably strong and intelligent.
"What are we going to do?"
the child asked. But my mind couldn't function fast enough. Instead, I just wondered how it had all come to this. The very first creatures appeared years earlier. We'd just celebrated Halloween like normal. Decorations covered the neighborhood, and children were running around in hundreds of different costumes. I'd made custom candies that looked like blood-filled syringes. It was just Jell-O inside a plastic tube, but the kids loved it. But that very year, one of them went inexplicably missing. There hadn't been any adults present at the time of the disappearance, but according to the other kids around, there had been a faceless child wandering the streets among them. At first, they just assumed it was an incredibly cool costume. But as the skin started sloughing off its body and tendrils started growing out from its head, they tried to escape. Unfortunately, one of the kids got caught up in the tendrils and was left behind, never to be seen again. Of course, the government called these kids out as unreliable eyewitnesses and started their own fruitless investigation. As the next year rolled around, adults were required to accompany their children on their yearly round of trick-or-treat. Alas, that year even more children and adults alike vanished from the face of the earth. Then the next year, and the next. It took far too long before we'd realized exactly what was going on. Halloween became a forbidden holiday, with a mandatory curfew after 5 p.m. For years, those who remained inside were mostly fine, but those dumb enough to venture outside in the dark on October 31st hardly ever came back.
"What are we going to do?"
the kid asked again. Just moments ago, I'd saved his life. Though I feared our safety would be short-lived, I had to come up with a plan before the monsters broke through. Had my family still been around, I wouldn't even have opened the door. But they were among the first victims, and I had nothing left to keep me alive. My first idea was to leave through the back door, but then we'd surely get caught in the act. I had to find a way to save the child, even if it meant my own demise. After a moment of contemplation, I decided to go with the only feasible chance of escape. "Come on, kid. It's time to get you to safety." I led him to the back door with only a minute left before the creatures got through. "You know the neighbor, Mr. Jackson?" I asked. The kid nodded. He was one of the few to grant strangers refuge in his house during Halloween. He typically locked the door once night fell over town. But if I distracted the monstrosities that occupied the street, the kid just might have a chance to gain his attention. "I want you to run over to his house, climb up the drain pipe, and knock on his bedroom window. Can you do that?" I asked. Again, he just nodded, panic rising through his body.
What about you?"
"I'm gonna stay here, buy you some time. Now get the hell out of here." I gave the kid a gentle push out of the door, and pointed my shotgun against the cracking front door. It had just been in time. They had broken through. I fired a round at the first monster, which pushed them all back outside, if only for a second. Still, the shot was loud enough to alert every single monster crowding the neighborhood. As they all rushed inside my house, I retreated upstairs into my bedroom. At a record pace, I boarded up the door, trapping myself inside. I checked my ammunition, knowing I could only take out a few at best. I only have about a minute left before they get through. I'm recording this message as my last spoken words on this planet. A voicemail to explain that I didn't give up my life for nothing. I just hope they don't
If you ever see black-eyed children, please don't make the same mistake that I did. By Lighthouse Horror.
In October of last year, I saw the black-eyed children for the first time. They floated outside the open window, their skin a pale white, and their eyes as dark and void as the deepest hole you can imagine. I had become lost in those eyes. Have you ever had a nightmare you can't remember? I awoke abruptly, covered in sweat, and my heart beating faster than it had ever before. Yet I couldn't recall the things going on in my mind that had shaken me so thoroughly. Sitting up at the edge of my bed, I stared over at my 8-year-old son. "Ben, monsters aren't real. There's nothing to be afraid of," I had said night after night with little result. But that wasn't true, was it? There was plenty to be afraid of. Since his mother had died, each night had progressed the same. I would tuck him in, Ben would promise me that he would stay in his own room tonight, and I would kiss him on the forehead. I then walked tiredly to my own bedroom, closed the door quietly, took more than my own fair share of melatonin, and drifted off to sleep. Upon awakening, I would most certainly find my son gently nestled against my shoulder. Thinking it to be the natural result of losing his mother, I hadn't thought of it much. That was until the nightmares started, and the children began their nightly visit. The first night I saw them, I was sure it had been a dream. The bed was nearly pressed up against the window, and my son was directly below it. The two children reached their arms through the opening and were only inches away from grabbing my son. Somehow holding back a scream, I reached out to push the cold arms away, and then I shut the window and locked it with a loud click. "Dad," Ben had said, having perhaps awoken from his own nightmare. Before he could see the children, I quickly closed the curtains and pressed my back up against the window. "What are you doing, Dad?" he continued. "Nothing. Go back to sleep," I said quietly, having no idea what to say or do. This was what I did do. Each night, I would lock the windows securely and shut the blinds so tightly that it was impossible to see anything. I made it a rule in our house that each night every window must be locked securely and the blinds shut. I think I made up some excuse about burglars choosing houses where they could see inside. A few nights later, I peeked through the blinds and saw the two children, pale as death, back to where they had been the first night. I became lost in the depth of their eyes and I watched as they looked from me to my son.
No, you can't have him,
I whispered angrily, snapping back into reality and pushing the blinds closed. As time continued, Ben's nightmares increased.
Dad, sometimes at night I see things,
Ben said, fear washing all over his face. I interrupted quickly. I know what you see, Ben, and don't worry, they can't get you. He began to cry as he looked up at me.
You promise?
Tears flowed down my cheeks then as well, and I hugged him close. I promise. Embracing him tightly, I looked over his shoulder and towards the tightly shut window. I couldn't see the dead children, but I still knew they were out there. Perhaps there were even more than the night before. Months went by, and Ben eventually got to the point where he wanted to try sleeping in his own room again.
I don't want to be afraid anymore, Dad.
He paused and looked up at me.
They can't get me, right?
I was lost for words, trying to hide the fact that I was indeed thinking it over. I had not only boarded off my son's bedroom window, but had sealed it as well. Nothing could get through. I was sure of it. And it wasn't right to have my son always living in fear. Okay, Ben, I said. Shortly after, I set up a live camera in the corner of his room, facing his bed where the window had been. I wanted my son to find courage and face his fears, but I didn't want to take any chances either. I tested the camera feed carefully and then went to tuck him in. Kissing him on the forehead, my son hugged me close.
Don't worry, Dad. I'm not afraid anymore,
he said. I was beyond proud of my son. Not only had he lost his mother, he had been given real monsters to contend with, and he had shown courage and determination in the face of it all. I'm so proud of you, I whispered. That night, I didn't sleep at all, only watching the camera feed to my son's room. I had placed the lens facing his bed and closed off the window just in case. Nothing happened for hours until I did something so simple, something I would regret for the rest of my life. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I was gone no more than 20 seconds when I heard him.
Dad!
Ben screamed, making me drop the glass. I watched as it shattered onto the kitchen floor.
Ben!
I screamed, rushing to his bedroom.
Ben, hang on!
I shouted again, now just outside his room. When I burst through the door, I felt my heart stop. My son's bed was empty, and he was gone.
Ben! Ben!
I screamed, searching frantically for him. The window was still boarded off and sealed, yet my son was gone nonetheless. The police never found him, and I could tell from how the detective in charge eyed me over that I was their main suspect. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I found Ben's drawings from the previous months. There were no dead children outside the window, and no monsters with black eyes. There was something else entirely. Please, if you ever see the black-eyed children outside your window, please, God, don't make the same mistake I did. They aren't monsters. I think they were trying to warn us. As I sit today and stare out the window, I tell myself that maybe, just maybe, I'll find my son again one day. I have to think that. It's the only thing that keeps me alive. I glanced down at my son's notebook from months earlier. One page stands out among the rest. There is a drawing of his room, the window boarded off, and my son sleeping peacefully. The closet door is cracked open, and a large clawed hand can be seen reaching through towards his bed. The rural area I grew up in made the smallest towns appear densely populated. It was the sort of place where you had to cycle a mile or so to the nearest neighbor, and the bus only came twice a day. Most kids think growing up on a farm is some sort of constantly thrilling adventure. The kids at my school in the nearest town certainly did. They didn't see me waking up at 4 in the morning just to get ready in time for my parents to get me there, or how lonely the weekends were when your friends lived so far away. No, they thought it was just all chickens and tractors. In truth, I resented it. The farm was on a large plot of land. We had acres surrounding the house, ending at a thick forested border that separated us from 2 distant neighbors and some fields. My parents would let me play freely on the farm from a young age. My only rule was to stay on the land that we owned. Where the trees started, I should have always stopped. Boredom was a killer. Chickens aren't so exciting when they're your day-to-day life, and there's only so much fun a kid can have on their own. When I was about 8 years old, I started to explore the woods that made up the border, at first weaving in and out of the trees on the edge of the farm, and eventually building up the courage to go deeper into the forest. I was careful, making sure that I embarked on my adventures almost as soon as I'd left the house, so that I had the maximum time to explore without being caught by Mum and Dad. The day I first made it through the border, I was trying to time how long it took to walk through the trees. It was 15 minutes until I reached the clearing owned by Mr. Hinchcliffe, an elderly potato farmer to the left of us. He was known by the local people for being insular and quiet. It was a large, circular clearing, cut off from the rest of his land by a different species of tree to the ones in the forest. It's like they had been planted years before to create and keep the clearing separate and hidden. In the center of the circle was a man who stood facing me, unmoving. I was terrified at first, convinced that Mr. Hinchcliffe was about to march me home for trespassing. I tried to conceal myself behind a tree whilst keeping an eye on the man, realizing he hadn't moved much. It took me a moment, but the poles eventually gave it away. That and the lack of feet. The figure started from the ankles. The man in the clearing wasn't a man at all. He was a scarecrow. I was fascinated. I stayed behind the tree but strained my eyes enough to try and get a better look. My parents put scarecrows up around our crops, but none of ours were ever as elaborate as the one that stood in the middle of Mr. Hinchcliffe's clearing. He was so realistic, more realistic than anything I had ever seen before. He wore a red checked shirt, a straw hat, and a wide smile stitched across his face from the corner of one side of his mouth to the other. I wanted to get closer, but as I started to emerge from the trees, I could feel his eyes on me and could have sworn that I saw his fingers move. I ran back through the woods to the farm, eager to get home and try to forget about what I'd seen, my little heart pounding. I didn't tell my parents about the Scarecrow or the clearing, but as I lay in bed that night, all I could think about was that smile stitched across the face. I spent hours that night convincing myself that scarecrows couldn't move. What I'd seen must have been the wind. I was just freaking out over nothing. I tried to stop myself going back, but I desperately wanted to get a closer look. I wondered what Mr. Hinchcliffe had used to make his scarecrow look so realistic, and my curiosity eventually got the best of me. 3 days after my initial discovery, I left the farm and made my way through the same dense section of woods until I reached the clearing again. I stopped behind the same tree as before, inspecting the scarecrow until I gathered the bravery to get a little closer. Mr. Hinchcliffe's creation was even more spectacular up close. I couldn't work out what material he had used to make the face. It was like something out of a film. I touched the skin to try and understand what it was, but I couldn't. It felt like my own, but just colder. I was in complete awe. The smile had been stitched into the skin-like material. It must have taken the old man hours. If the Scarecrow ever had feet, they had been buried into the dirt to try and help him stand. Poles were driven into the ground behind him and tied to the torso, keeping him propped up and secured. The longer I looked at the Scarecrow, the more I started to feel like he was alive in ways. I was certain that he occasionally blinked and that his chest rose and fell. I was cautious and more than a little unsettled, but I took my time and inspected him as much as I could. Walking back to the farm through the trees, I couldn't get the Scarecrow out of my thoughts. I struggled to make conversation over dinner, my mind completely filled with that stitched-up smile. I became obsessed. I returned every day for the next 3 weeks. The clearing became my place of solace, and the Scarecrow that stood there my best friend. I would sit by his planted ankles reading and drawing in my sketchbook. I named the Scarecrow Peter and spoke to him whenever I could. I told him my deepest thoughts and feelings, even cried to him when I was sad, and spent every moment that I could with him. I was careful not to sit in the clearing for too long, and always returned to the farm before my parents felt I was gone. I wished I could have spent more time with Peter. It's sad when I think back to what a lonely kid I must have been to spend so much time with an object, a glorified effigy of a human. With every visit, the rising and falling of Peter's chest lessened. I stopped catching him blinking, and his skin started to sag in a strange way and grayed after a few days of the rain. I knew it must just be me getting used to him, realizing that he was never going to spring to life and answer me like a real friend I'd wanted. But it still made me a little sad. After a while, Peter's magic was gone. I would go and visit like always, but it didn't feel the same. The clearing was empty as the rest of my life, and my propped-up friend in the middle was in a sorry state. The stitched smile barely held itself in place now, and the lumps of the material that made up his skin had started to dry and fall off. He couldn't even scare the birds away anymore, and often he had multiples perched on his straw hat and shoulders, pecking at his face. One day toward the end of that summer, I made my way through the clearing to find it empty. Peter was gone. There wasn't a trace of him left bar the pole that stuck firmly into the ground. Despite the fact that my initial fascination with Peter was already depleted, it still felt like a terrible blow. My parents couldn't understand why I became so withdrawn. I was grieving for someone that had never actually existed. 8 years old, and I already understood what it was to mourn a friend. I visited the clearing multiple times, but it remained empty. School restarted, and the autumn hit, bringing with it ice-cold winds that would frost the entire land. I spent less time outside and barely visited Mr. Hinchcliffe's clearing through the winter. By the time we reached the next summer, Peter and the time I'd spent with my silent friend was all but forgotten. It was by chance on a sunny day that I decided to walk through the woods one more time to my old sanctuary. I didn't expect it. I thought that part of my life was over. But there she was, an entirely new Scarecrow, propped up just like Peter had been, ankles pressed firmly into the ground with poles behind her. She wore a different outfit, dungarees and a yellow checked shirt, but the straw hat was unmistakably the same. Her chest rose and fell gently, just like Peter's had once, and her eyes appeared to move barely millimeters as I looked into them. It was almost impossible to see, but I was sure that she was alive. She gave me hope that I wouldn't have to spend a summer lonely and sad on that farm. Her stitched smile gave me the same familiar, comforting feeling as warm hot chocolate on a chilly night. The process repeated, just like it had with Peter. As the weeks passed, she started to look more haggard, peaked and less alive. The magic too became less, the loneliness returned, and eventually she disappeared entirely. Every year would be the same. Summer would come, and with it Mr. Hinchcliffe would build a new Scarecrow. They came in every age, shape, and gender. A new friend that I knew would wither and vanish just like the others. Regardless, I grew attached to every single one of them. As I got older and my parents awarded me with more free time, I was able to spend more time in the town with friends that actually spoke back. After a while, I started to forget about the Scarecrows, favoring girls and nights out to sitting with inanimate objects. Years passed by, and I left home to take a degree in art. University changed my life. For the first time, I had a group of friends around me all the time, ones that weren't planted in the ground. I moved in with them and only went home for Christmas. I never forgot about Mr. Hinchcliffe's Scarecrows, though. They were my lifetime for so long, but I did move on. I didn't need them anymore. It's been 3 years since I spent a summer on the farm, and lockdown with this virus has forced me back here. When my housemates all returned to their families, I couldn't bear the idea of just me being in the house, so I did the same. I wasn't intending to visit the clearing. In fact, it's been years since I really thought about it. I've been wrapped up too much in a social life that I never had as a kid. It was only when my mother brought up her new friend Linda, who now lived at the farm to the left, that I was reminded of my childhood secret, one that I now wish I could erase.
What happened to Mr. Hinchcliffe?
I asked, my heart sinking at the sudden realization that I would never get to see another one of his amazing creations. My mother hung her head, trying to plan a response.
It was awful, Charlie. All over the local news. He stopped responding to his sister's calls last year, and after a while, she sent local police to do a welfare check. When they arrived, he wasn't in the house, so they started searching the land, and they found him, collapsed in a wooded bit just on the other side of our trees. He died of a heart attack. Why would that make the news? I asked, a bead of sweat running down my neck as I imagined Mr. Hinchcliffe dead in the clearing. My clearing. My mother's face somehow lowered further. He wasn't alone, Charlie. They found a woman strapped to a pole next to his body. He'd been injecting her with some sort of drug that kept her completely paralyzed while conscious. He'd planted her feet in the ground just to keep her upright and dressed her up like a scarecrow. Police combed the land and found 45 such bodies buried. He'd been at it for 45 years. I felt bile rising in my throat. My mind started to connect the dots that I'd never imagined. What happened to the girl? I asked. She survived, barely. When they finally got her conscious, she wrote a letter explaining that she'd been strapped to that pole for 2 weeks before she was found. Hinchcliffe took every precaution possible to keep her alive up there. Worst of all, she can only communicate through writing now, after what he did to her face. The sick fuck cut her mouth up, only to stitch it back into a smile.
The Witch's Tree.
There has always been a legend going on in our town, a legend that dates back all the way to colonial times, a legend that involves a woman by the name of Allison Gregory. Allison was a woman who lived in a small village in Delaware during the late colonial era. It was a peaceful, quiet town. There was never really many conflicts there. Everybody just lived a normal life. Nobody really knew Allison. She was usually such a quiet woman. She never really got involved in social affairs or anything like that. Normally she was practically a shut-in. She would just stay in her house and not go out as much. She never really had many friends. Now, during this time, there was already paranoia of witches and evil forces, which caused people to kill many innocents out of fear. One day there was a knock on Allison's door. When she opened it, it was a message from another town. There was news that her sister, who lived in that town, was accused of being a witch and killed. Allison was dumbfounded. She could not believe what she had heard. For days she would mourn her lost sister. Then one day she stopped mourning. She was not heard of for months after that. There was no sign of her in the home or anything. It was during these months where the town which killed her sister fell into chaos. There was famine, citizens falling ill, deaths in the mayor's family. A month earlier, the mayor's son went missing, and the mayor ordered a full-scale search for his son, but with no prevailing. Weeks later, the crops went bad, the soil being treated with some strange dark purple liquid. As all the crops were ruined, famine started to occur. Just days later, people fell ill with the deaths of the mayor's loved ones. When the bodies were examined, their insides contained traces of this purple liquid. The town knew that whatever was happening because of this purple liquid. The doctors tried researching what it was, running tests on it, crude and rudimentary considering the times. As it turned out, it was blood, but not just blood. The blood of the mayor's son, with some type of mysterious elements mixed in. When Allison's village heard of this, they knew it must have been her. They knew she had done it for revenge. So they broke down her door to find her in the basement. She seemed awful, ragged. She shook violently as her beady eyes looked at the mob. The villagers noticed that there was all different types of liquids and jars of powder on her shelves. 2 people then charged at Allison. They knocked her to the ground. She fell unconscious. In this state, the mob tied her up and carried her outside. These 2 people saw something covered by a sheet on a bed. The sheet was bloodied. When they lifted the sheet, there was the mutilated body of the mayor's missing son. His abdomen cut open, ritualistic marks all over his forehead, his body all cut up and covered in blood. The mob carried Allison into the forest. The night was cold and dark. In the forest, they found a tree, its branches bare, its bark was black. It looked as if no life was left in it. They took another rope and tied her to the tree. Allison screamed and struggled with no avail. The local priest came up to her. He carried a blessed dagger. He held it up to the sky and chanted his holy words. When the chanting was over, the priest raised the dagger and stabbed her through the heart. Both Allison and her screaming died. Today, there's a legend saying that since the tree had no life in it, the ghost of Allison went into that tree and now lays dormant in it. The tree is now called the Witch's Tree, and anybody that says this chant will free her spirit. Witch's soul, now lost forever, I summon thee, Allison Gregor. Her ghost will haunt that person 3 days, then they will die. It is rumored that these bodies thus killed contain traces of a type of purple liquid.
Another haunted house creep by Spooky Coffee.
For the past 2 years, I have been working at a haunted house attraction. It's a really fun gig, but the job tends to attract some rather creepy individuals. For the first 2 years that I have worked there has always been some kind of creep that works there. This post in particular will recount my second year's creepy incident. I'll start the story with Orientation Day. This is where we meet all the other fellow actors and choose our respective roles. When I walked into the building, my heart fell to the pit of my stomach. A man who looked like the same creeper from the first year at the haunted house was waiting for orientation to start, but I knew it couldn't possibly be the same man, because the man from my first year had killed himself months ago. And to make matters even stranger, this man had the same name, Daniel. So first, I thought this was all a wild coincidence. There was no way this man would also turn out to be a creep. Boy, was I wrong. Allow me to describe Daniel. He was a man probably in his late 40s or early 50s. He was a short and pudgy man. From the beginning, everyone could kind of tell that he was a little socially awkward. There was nothing wrong with that, but he really did kind of creep out most of the workers. Additionally, he couldn't drive, so he was either super early to work or super late, and he was usually the last to leave. So overall, he was a peculiar fellow. But hey, we're all working at a peculiar job. Orientation came and went without any issues, apart from my own fright, and that Halloween the attraction started. To understand the story, let me explain where I was located in the attraction. I was located in a large maze outside of the main house with about 5 other guys, including Daniel. These 5 guys were scattered throughout the maze, and I was at the center of it in a large rectangular room. This room was enclosed, unlike the rest of the maze, and had 2 exits. All of the guys beside Daniel were around my age, which was 18. I don't even know whose brilliant idea it was to put a lone girl in a large maze with 5 guys. Thankfully, I was somewhat friends with one of the guys, so I didn't feel too alone. However, this friend was located at the tail end of the maze. Daniel was located decently close to my room, but that didn't bother me at first. There was no reason for Daniel or any other guy to enter my room. They all had their positions to handle. One other thing to understand about this maze is that all of the actors were still able to see one another because the walls of the maze were relatively short. So, despite being away from my friend, I was still able to see him. Now, I hope that explained things clearly. Nothing strange occurred the first 2 nights, but on the 3rd night, Daniel made his move. When no customers were going through the attraction, the actors would just walk around the maze or sit on the ground to relax. During these times, I would leave my room and either sit on the ground somewhere or enter the main house to grab a water bottle. In order to entertain the main house, I would have to go through the maze and pass Daniel's area. The first few times that I did this, Daniel said nothing and would just watch me. But on the 3rd day, he finally mustered up enough courage to say, "Hey, how are you?" Not thinking anything to it, I happily replied and carried on to fetch a water bottle. From then on, any time I passed him, he always had the same comment. It was harmless at first. Things like, "You're really good. The weather's out. It's nice. You're a pretty scary actor." So, other than that, he always had something to say. I really didn't think too much of it. Days continued on, and Daniel kept getting a little braver. In between breaks, he would awkwardly walk toward the center of the maze. He moved quite slowly, like he was trying to be stealthy. My only saving grace was that before he could reach the room, a group of customers would begin to approach, and he would have to run back to his position. This was when alarm bells began to ring. I knew there was no reason for Daniel to leave his position and come to mine. Now, whenever I saw that he was motioning toward my room, I would go out in the other direction in the hopes to put more distance between us. It didn't help that he was dressed in a scary costume and wearing a mask. These things only added to the tension. On the times when I chose to sit on the ground and wait for customers, Daniel would go through the maze and stand where a single wall separated us. Looking back, I should have just walked away. But I didn't want to come off as rude punk-ass teenager. This is when he introduced himself, even though we'd already been on that an orientation day. Trying to play nice, I introduced myself, and we shook hands. Then he said the words I will never forget. "You're beautiful." This caught me so off guard that all I could say was, I'm sorry." He then repeated himself and kept his gaze locked on me. I thanked him awkwardly and refused to make eye contact with him. Keep in mind, I'm an 18-year-old girl, and he was a man in his 40s or 50s. I'm also covered in sweat, mud, and fake blood. Thoroughly creeped out, I was now determined to avoid him at all costs. Whenever we had breaks, I now went through the maze in the opposite direction of Daniel in order to get to the main house. It was a longer route, but it was worth it. Daniel soon noticed this and now put more of an effort in his walking toward my room between breaks. There were several times when he actually entered the room, but thankfully I had the wits to leave the room entirely
and go stand where my friend was. Daniel would just stand in my room, look around, and one time he even sat down on the floor. It was actually comical sometimes to see him standing in the room, realizing customers were coming, then to rush out there and back into his position. Sadly, with how dark the maze was, I couldn't always get a sharp eye on Daniel's whereabouts. There was one incident where he approached me unexpectedly and said, "I like the way you scream." One of my lines that I said in the attraction to customers was, "You can't leave me, I need you." And Daniel just absolutely ate that up and loved it. Well, you can bet that after he said he liked that line, I stopped using it. I had to endure a month of this, but over time, Daniel got the message that I was not interested. In retaliation, he began to steal my scare points. There were certain areas, scare points near my room, that I would pop out of and scare customers. These scare points, so-called, were accessible only to the other actors, but no one else used them but me. I suppose Daniel was mad that I wasn't giving him any attention, so he decided to diss me and steal my scare point as revenge. He also began to copy some of my lines. Thankfully, toward the end of the haunt season in October, the managers of the attraction moved me inside into the main house. I'm not sure why, because I didn't say anything to them about Daniel, even though I knew I should have. So for the final days working there leading up to Halloween, I was nowhere near Daniel. When the season ended, I was relieved. However, the managers had the bright idea to open up a Christmas-themed haunted house, and they asked me to work out. I loved the job and didn't plan on having a creep ruin it for me. Although the many actors from the Halloween season didn't return for the Christmas attraction, Daniel was not one of them. He was there, and boy was he thrilled to see that I returned as well. This time, however, I convinced my best friend to work there as well. So with my best friend being there, she sort of acted as a deterrent for Daniel. Throughout the whole season, he never approached me. Well, that was until the final night. My friend and I were chilling in one of the rooms and waiting on customers. This room was the first room in the attraction, so everyone else was passing in order to get to their positions. Daniel began to pass through, then suddenly turned back around to face my friend and me. Again, with those beady, never-blinking eyes, he said, "I think you two are beautiful." I just cringed and looked away as my friend shyly replied, "Thank you." So, overall, Daniel is pretty creepy, but I suspect that maybe he doesn't know what he is doing is wrong. I don't think he realizes that flirting with young girls and trying to be in a room alone with them is okay. How many dumb men are like that, am I right? I caught word that he might be autistic, but I don't know for sure. But the feeling of dread I had in that maze is a feeling I will never forget. In retrospect, I really should have told someone. I kept telling myself that if Daniel did one more thing or tried to enter my room again, that I would tell the managers. One thing that I can think of at least lightens the mood, though, is that his costume was literally Tree Man. His mask was just a tree with a contorted, scary face. When customers would walk by, they would all shout, "Look, it's Groot!" It got a good laugh out of me every time. If I explained the story poorly, I'm sorry, and please ask anything if you're confused. So, Daniel, maybe you're just looking for love, but you're looking in the wrong places, man. I'm assuming I will see you again this coming Halloween season, and if I do, just please stay away from me.
That one Friday the 13th.
When I was younger, my parents would always arrange playdates for me because I wasn't exactly the most social of kids and didn't really have that many friends. Back then, I felt annoyed with them when they did this. Unlike other kids, I didn't mind sitting in my room, tipping my plastic crate of Star Wars toys upside down and acting out stories with the most acrobatic lightsaber battles you'd ever seen. I suppose doing this all the time by myself was slightly weird, and being an only child, I'd be lying if I told you there wasn't times I didn't wish somebody else could be there, if only so that space battles and ground duels could happen simultaneously. My problem was, though, that unless I knew you, I wasn't likely to interact with you, which was quite the dilemma for my young mind. So in retrospect, it was probably a good thing that I was forced to sit in the bedrooms of a variety of different kids, awkwardly agreeing to whatever they wanted to do while I sweated over their opinion of me. Truly, I would have been more grateful for it now than I am, if it hadn't been for that one Friday the 13th. My parents wanted to go out to dinner, so I was pawned off on a couple of new friends of theirs for the night, as they had a child who was of similar age to me. I did my usual tantrums and begging, but with less enthusiasm compared to those first few times. I knew the drill by that point. They weren't going to change their minds. When I got there, he was in the middle of having a bath, so his parents told me I could just go into one of his rooms and play with his toys. This ended up with me sat on a chair, arms folded and bored in his room because my social awkwardness wouldn't dare let me touch some kid's toys without asking. I stuck to a strict look but don't touch policy, though the temptation was high when I saw Stretch Armstrong sitting on his desk. That was the latest fad at the time, and it looked amazing in all those commercials that would play on Cartoon Network. I just wanted to see if it really could stretch for miles. At that point, I heard someone running toward the room. I turned to the door, and a kid, younger than I am, appeared. He said hello, and was all excitable and friendly. He told me his big brother was taking a bath, and asked if I wanted to see something. This kind of put me at ease being there, to be honest. I loved kids that didn't really care what I had to say, and that could just talk and talk. I agreed to see whatever it was he wanted to show me, and followed him. He took me through to the kitchen, and there was a door there that he opened which led to a basement. He walked halfway down the stairs and just stood still, pointing at something that was in the corner of the room. I climbed down to where he was and tried to get a better look at it. I asked him what it was, but he just kept pointing at it and ushering me over to it. I thought it was just some dumb game he was playing, or something, so I went right down the stairs and approached it. As I got closer, all I could see was some sort of scrumpled up brown paper bag. It looked like it was quite soggy. There was a nearby rake, so I picked it up and prodded at the thing before deciding to open it up. When I opened it, I almost threw up right there on the spot. The stench was horrendous. I can still remember that smell even now. It was this cat. It was dead, but obviously not for long. I began dry heaving after I noticed its right arm bone had popped out through. I remember the little brother just laughing and laughing at me, and then running away. I went straight back to the room afterwards and saw my playdate in there at that point. I couldn't think of anything to say to the kid, and I felt quite nervous, so I just blurted out this story of the dead cat to his brother. I remember telling him this story, and he just gave me this look. It was a look as if he was some sort of crazy person, nodding along, but his face was screwing up the more I told him. Once I told him the full story, he just sort of froze for a second, looking confused and shit. Then he turned to me, and he said something I will never forget till the day I die. I don't have a brother. My parents never took me for a play date again after that, and to this day whenever I bring it up, I swear this must have been my imagination or something that I remember wrong. It's become a sort of tradition of mine to question them on this date because it reminds me of that strange little boy. We moved away from that town a few years later, and it's been 15 years, and to this day I still don't really know what happened. But I swear that kid was really there.
A week before Halloween, and we still didn't have a pumpkin. What kind of father was I? True, Molly and I had just moved the kids to St. Simon's Island in September, but that was still no excuse. Not when we all loved Halloween, especially our 8-year-old daughter Sarah and 7-year-old son John. I'd already put up the reliable witch and ghost decorations. Now I just needed the granddaddy of them all, a jack-o'-lantern. Molly and the kids left for a hayride and a ghost tour, so like an archaeology hunt, Michael had to get the pumpkin all by himself. Late Friday evening, I made my way down to the pumpkin patch, a patch sponsored by St. Simon's United Methodist Church. The place was small and close to the beach. Nothing more than a cute fake field, one surrounded by abandoned buildings and playgrounds, rather than barns and plantations. Already, sunlight faded around me. My UGA hoodie no match for the howling wind. The breeze blew my long blonde hair everywhere, making dirt fly into my big blue eyes and pointed nose. But still, I had a job to do. Fatherhood was much more important than the thankless stress of being a realtor for this wealthy community. Amidst the darkening darkness, I explored the church's pumpkin patch. A clean white picket fence entrapped me with all the other St. Simon stragglers, attractive cashiers, and a sea of pumpkins. As I walked past a tent, I waved at the teenage boy and girl managing the cash register. Armed with their beaming smiles and beaming baby blues, they waved back. Soon, I passed a large mirror and a grinning Scarecrow, my reflection shrouded by the twilight sky. The search was agonizing. Sarah and John's pleas for pumpkins blared through my mind, as did Molly's profane demands. The chilling breeze wasn't helping, nor was the dying sunlight. I needed the perfect pumpkin. Not one of those babies or behemoths. The multicolored ones were too silly, the blue ones obnoxious, the gray ghastly, the wrinkled too damned ugly. Turning, I saw a wooden pumpkin watching me. Its red painted smile was wide open to a laugh, wide open to taunt me, and given its size, wide open to eat me. I felt the pressure of the pumpkin patch, claustrophobic in this Halloween cluster. The smiling scarecrows surrounded me. The Charlie Brown photo on the boards bullied me. And then, finally, I saw it. A clean, pristine pumpkin in the corner. An all-American beauty sitting all by itself, right up against the fence. Relief hit me. This was a combination of love and scare at first sight. I knew this pumpkin was the one. Eager, I stepped up to the strange shrine and picked up the orange treasure. The plant felt light, bulky but hollow. Smirking, I tossed it in my hands like a basketball. Even Sarah and John could carry this baby. Through the twilight darkness, I leaned in closer, a closer examination. And then I saw where the pumpkin had already been carved. A crude lobotomy ran all around the stump, the pumpkin's lid ready to be pulled. A gust of breeze bombarded my hair. Feeling slight unease, I shook my bangs to the side and looked towards the patch. Only 2 customers were left. Them and the teenage couple were all that remained. Only now we stood in pitch blackness. The dark intermission before dawn had just given way to night. Yet I couldn't shake the lingering dread. Who the hell carved the pumpkin, and why was it out here for sale? Furthermore, why was it all by itself? Moonlight illuminated the scene. I glanced up to see a glowing full moon. Several lights then cut out from the tent. I knew I had to go. Molly and the kids needed me. Our preparations for Halloween 2019 were almost complete. My arms wobbled. Somehow, the pumpkin now felt heavier. I looked back at the orange canvas. A new face now stared back at me. No silly grin, no crooked scream, nothing carved. Instead, what I saw was a glaring human face, a real human face. I couldn't scream or cry out in horror. My hands stayed bound to the orange head. Familiar baby blues peered out from that jack-o'-lantern. I saw a pointed nose, an affable smirk, an exact snapshot of how I looked moments earlier. Caught between disbelief and terror, I stared on at my pumpkin portrait. I didn't want to believe the scary sight, but I had no other choice. Trembling, I ran my hands along the face. There was no hard, cold touch, nor were the nose or the eyes painted. Instead, my fingers began to sink into flesh. This jack-o'-lantern wore an all-too-human mask, and one that looked just like me. "What the heck?" I muttered. My fear only increased, particularly since my own blue eyes were glowing at me. Frantic, I reached towards the stump and yanked out the lid. The vague lighting was clear to show me the horror within. There was a gooey mess in there, all right, just not a massacre of seeds and orange mush. No, a human brain was inside, a brain left in pieces and smithereens from so many scoops and slices. Skull fragments replaced the pumpkin seeds, red blood the juice. Terror paralyzed me. I felt numb, hollow. No longer did I even feel that chilling wind. I faced the tent. "What the hell is this?" I shouted. Startled, the couple faced me, then let out a collective scream into the night. The mirror showed me why. That wasn't Michael in the reflection. Not with the triangular eyes, the evil smile, the facial features comically carved onto my face in grotesque fashion. All white flickering flames fluttered beneath my flesh. My flesh. It wasn't me. More screams erupted through the patch. Behind my pumpkin plastic surgery, I watched the disturbing scene unfold. Moonlight illuminated the teenage couple and the remaining customers, and now I had a better look at them, or rather, at their transformation. During the panic, they still showed carved smiles and glares. Like me, their faces morphed from human to ghoulish jack-o'-lantern masks. Real-life masks. The 5 of us now nothing more than walking Halloween caricatures. And then I saw the pumpkins resembled us more than we did, at least what we used to be. They had big eyes, calm smiles, defining facial features, all of it melded onto their orange skin with precision. No longer were we in a pumpkin patch. This was a damned wax museum, an uncanny valley of excited jack-o'-lanterns. Silence settled onto St. Simon's. None of us could talk. Our smiles stayed permanent. All I could do was exchange frozen glances with the others. No way we could share words, our tormented emotions seen only through our triangular eyelids. Like an avalanche of sadness, Halloween memories hit me hard. Molly, Sarah, John. Instead of a pumpkin, they'd be getting a disfigured father. And now, instead of tears, I cried orange slime, felt yellow seeds stick to my cheeks. To the slime. Long hair brushed against my arm. I then confronted my chosen pumpkin. Its skin was now pale white. Blonde hair replaced the stump, and on that jack-o'-lantern, my face became all the more detailed.
Story the Second. There was once a time when vampires were as common as leaves or grass, or berries in a pail, and they never kept still, but wandered round at night among the people. They walked about and joined the evening gatherings in the villages, and when there were many young people together, the vampires could carry out their habit of inspiring fear and sucking human blood like leeches. Once, when an evening gathering was in full swing, in came an uninvited guest, the vampire. But no one knew that he was a vampire. He was still in the form of a handsome youth, full of fun. He said good day very politely, sat down on a bank beside the girls, and began to talk, and all the girls imagined he was a youth from another part of the village. Then the vampire began to tell stories and jokes, so that the girls did not know what to do for laughter. He played and jested and bandied words with them without ceasing. But there was one girl to whom he paid special attention and teased unmercifully. "Keep still, friend. Have I done anything to annoy you?" said she. But he still kept on pinching her, till she was black and blue. "What is it, friend? You go too far with your joke. Do you want to make an end of me?" said the poor girl. At that moment, her distaff fell. When she stooped to pick it up, what did she see? The tail of the vampire. Then she said to the girl next to her, "Let's go. Run away. The creature is a vampire." The other girl was laughing so much that she did not understand. So the girl who knew the dreadful secret went out alone into the yard, on the pretext that she had to take some lengths of woven linen to the attic. Frightened out of her wits, she ran away with the linen. She ran into a forest, old as the world, and black as her fear. Her companions at the gathering awaited her return. They looked and waited until they saw that she was not coming back. Where could she be? "You must fetch her wherever she is," roared the vampire, with bloodshot eyes and hair standing on end. As the girl could not be found, the vampire killed all the rest of the merrymakers. He sucked their blood, he threw their flesh and bones under the bed, cut off their lips, and put their heads in a row at the window. They looked as if they were laughing. He strung up their intestines on a nail, saying they were strings of beads, and then he fled away. He arrived at the forest where the girl had taken refuge and found her under a beech tree. "Why did you come here, little girl? Why did you run away from the gathering?" The girl, poor thing, was so frightened that her tongue clove to her mouth and she could say nothing. "You are afraid, little girl. Come home with me. You'll feel better." Then, involuntarily, she asked, "Where?" "Here, in the forest. Come quicker," said the vampire. They arrived at a hole in the depth of the forest, and she saw that this was the home of the vampire. He pressed her to enter first. No, I do not want to. You go first." So the vampire went in and began to sweep and clear up. The girl, however, stopped up the hole with lengths of linen and fled quickly towards the east. In her flight, she saw a little light a long way off. She ran towards the light, came to a house, and found it empty except for a dead man who was lying stretched out on a table with a torch at his head and his hands crossed on his breast. What could she do? She entered the house, climbed up to the stove, and went to sleep, worn out by suffering and fear. And she would have rested well had not the terrible vampire pursued her. He had thrown aside the linen and rushed after her, mad with rage. He came into the house, and the dead man rose, and they fought and wrestled till the cock crew and the girl awoke. Now the light was out, the dead man was gone, and the only sound was the song of the little cricket. The girl was left alone with her guardian angel. The dead man and the vampire both vanished at cockcrow, for both were vampires. Waking up in the darkness, the girl looked round the house 3 times, for she thought she was at home and had had a horrible dream, and then fell asleep again, calmly and fearlessly. When she woke again and saw all the beauties of the forest and heard all the songs of the birds, she was amazed and thought herself in heaven. She did not stop long in wonder, but set out for her parents' house, hoping to bring them back with her. She reached her home and began to tell about the vampire and how he had gone, and what beautiful things she had seen in the woods of paradise. The parents looked at her, and full of amazement and doubt, made the sign of the cross. The girl sank into the ground, deeper and deeper, for she too had become a vampire. Poor thing. The vampire had bewitched her, and the beauty of the dwelling in the wood had enchanted her too much. Story the third. There was an evening gathering in the village, as is the custom, but the youths and maidens present were not the children of well-to-do parents. The gatherings were held in a deserted house. The youths were a noisy, laughing, mocking crowd who made themselves heard from one end of the village to the other, and the girls were just like them. They made a great fire, and the girls started spinning. The boys told all kinds of jokes, and the girls shook with laughter. After it had grown late, 3 young men, unknown to the company, entered the house. good evening," was said, and they joined in the general conversation. While everyone was talking, one of the girls dropped her distaff. The distaff fell under the stranger's feet, and the girl stooped to pick it up. When she went back to her seat, she was as white as chalk. "What is it?" asked one of those near her. The girl murmured that the 3 strangers had horses' hooves instead of feet. What was to be done? They whispered to one another and the boys that the 3 strangers were vampires, not men. Then, one by one, they slipped out of the door and went their ways homewards. The 3 vampires remained as vampires, but they did not remain alone in the house, for there was a girl asleep on the oven. With the dawn of the next day, the sister of the sleeping girl, together with some friends, came to see what had happened to her. When they were still some distance from the house, they saw a grinning face looking out of the window.
Oh,
they said.
our sister is laughing.
They drew nearer, and entering into the house, were horror-struck and made the sign of the cross. It was the head only which was in the window. The lips were cut off, and so the face seemed to smile. Her intestines were stretched out on the nails on the shelves, and the whole house was stained with blood.
My neighbors take Halloween a little too seriously. By color blindness.
Let me start out by saying that I'm not a people person. When the pandemic hit North America, it was probably the best damn thing that happened to me. Most of my time is spent online anyway, seeing as I work in a data collection unit for an auditing company. Let me tell you, that wasn't much fun either, given how crazy 2020 has been. Anyway, none of that has to do with the problem that I've been having, but I figured that most people start these rants off with a few anecdotal notes, so there you go. In a nutshell, I like to be left alone. That is why, when I walked out into early September and saw that my neighbors were already beginning to decorate their house with spooky stuff like inflatable Frankensteins and ghosts, I was a bit put off. Now, I will admit that they do this almost every year. They have 4 boys all in elementary school, and of course they always want the holidays to be big. So why should 2020 be any different, pandemic included? It's just that their house sits adjacent to mine, so when I walk out, it's the first thing I see every day. And now, thanks to these over-the-top decorations, I was going to be seeing even more of it. Gradually every day they added to the house. A few hanging plastic bats here, some spider webs there. I was doing my best to ignore it, really. And I know how I'm going to sound here, being the Grinch of Halloween to some. So naturally I kept it to myself. But that ended a few nights back when I started to hear the wails. They installed large speakers near the attic, I think because the screams coming from the attic were intense. It sounded like they literally had managed to get a soundbite from a crime scene. Let me tell you, hearing that kind of noise at 3:30 in the morning is a bit alarming. I instinctively dialed 911 and complained. I wasn't going to stay up all night simply because they wanted to turn their place into a haunted house. Unfortunately for me, the police said that if it wasn't a serious problem where the other neighbors complained, then it wasn't a serious violation of any noise ordinances in the neighborhood. You can't be serious. Just listen to this. How am I supposed to get any sleep? I shouted, holding the phone so they could hear. Maybe that was a bit much, but I was pissed, and I had every right to be, I think. What the hell did we have noise ordinances in this neighborhood for, if not to enforce them? The operator reminded me that the line was meant for emergencies only. Emergencies. And bid me a good night, leaving me frustrated and sleep-deprived. I went down to my kitchen, got a bottle of Jack, and drank enough to knock myself out on the couch, trying to time the obnoxious screams. The next day I had cooled down a little bit and went over to talk to my neighbors after breakfast. Crossing their front lawn was like going through a minefield, though, thanks to the pop-up ghosts and graves that they had placed in the yard, buried and then covered with sod to conceal them. The first few nearly gave me a heart attack as I moved to the door, rapping my knuckles on it to get their attention. No one came. I tried again, but got no response, so I walked around to the garage and tried there. It was open, and I couldn't help but notice that their car was gone, and that there was a large pool of fake blood on the concrete floor. God, the lengths these people went to celebrate. I stepped forward and noted that they had a few other decorations lying around too, like severed heads and zombie body parts, which I assumed would be placed in the front yard later. The whole thing smelled to high heaven, though. I held my nose for a bit and went to the door near the laundry room, trying again to get someone's attention, but again no one came. I sighed deeply and walked across the fake blood and paused to see where the bizarre smell was coming from. There were trash bags lying near the garage door, soaking wet from some recent rainstorm, and I rolled my eyes, realizing it had to be that. Despite the fact that I wasn't feeling very neighborly, I went ahead and took the trash to the street, and then went back to my house, wondering if any of my other neighbors would care enough to lodge a complaint. Other than this Halloween nut, the other folks around here are pretty ordinary, but none of them live close enough to really hear the noise like I do. I decided instead that night to try and record it, so that way I could let the authorities listen and prove I was dealing with a real nuisance on my block, not just some fabrication figment of my Halloween-crazed imagination. Back home, I took a shower and got some equipment from downstairs ready to listen. But surprisingly, there was no screams that night, just silence. I stayed up to the wee hours of the morning. I sound so old saying that, but it's true. I was thinking maybe they realized I had called and complained about them, so that was why they were quiet. So I called it a night and decided to try it again next day. It was more of the same though, not a peep. In fact, I was starting to notice that not one of my neighbors was coming out of their house. This guy had 4 kids. It's hard not to notice them in the early morning as they scramble to catch the bus, especially because the driver of the bus is so courteous that he blasts his horn to get the mom's attention for the littlest ones to grab a face mask. But now, there was nothing happening. It was that way for nearly a week, too, and I started to grow worried. I hated their Halloween decorations, granted, but this was becoming strange. At first, I told myself it was because I hadn't gotten much sleep. But then, I started doubting myself. What if the scream hadn't been some kind of faux imitation? It rolled around in my mind like a pair of old dice, trying to figure out what I heard. What if the wife had been attacked? What if it was a break-in? Then I thought back to the fake blood, and my body got stiff, thinking how I stepped through it. Had I mistakenly walked into a real crime scene? The arms, the severed heads. My paranoia was screaming to me. My God, how could I have been so blind? I grabbed my robe and rushed out into the dead of night to go see, using my smartphone's light as a guide across the murky suburb streets. Their house was so quiet now, not even a light on. I started to doubt myself again. Had it always been this quiet? I saw the plastic bats and pop-up graves, and they seemed like they had been there a lot longer than I remembered. Checking the garage got me nowhere. Now, instead of seeing blood, it was spotless,
as though someone had come in and cleaned the entire scene. It made me internally shiver as a dramatic scene played out in my mind. Chris, that was the husband's name. Chris was working in the kitchen, trying to get dinner ready because his wife, Janice, wasn't feeling good. It was a plot that had been brewing in my mind for months, I told myself. He was gradually lacing their food, yes, to weaken her, and tonight he planned to finish the job. The screams I had heard, they must have been when she realized something was off. Maybe Chris had decided he couldn't wait for her to just die. He wanted it to be swift. Had I seen him with a pretty young woman around town? Maybe. Yes, I think I had. In that coffee shop near the town square. Was he having an affair? If I was his age and knew his wife couldn't perform in the bedroom, I wouldn't have blamed him. But murder wasn't an answer. All of these thoughts scrambled through my brain as I stood there in the garage, taking in what had happened. I needed to get inside and check on his wife. What if he had left evidence? I ran back to my house, my heart racing now as I grabbed a few tools from my shed. I noticed, though, that some of them were missing, but I found what I needed. A crowbar could open my way into their house. I smashed it open in 2 tries and stepped into a dusty, dreary laundry room. Trying to turn on the lights had gotten me nowhere. Instead, it was obvious that the family wasn't paying their bills. The house was cold like a tomb. My footsteps echoed down the empty corridor as I called out to anyone inside, but it looked like the place was abandoned. I took a step forward when abruptly a fake axe smashed its way out of the wall and I jumped back. It was just another Halloween prop, but it looked so real, so lifelike. Chris must have just finished placing up more Halloween decorations when he decided to go up the stairs and take care of his wife. The boys had been in the den playing video games when they heard the screams. I imagined them running up to check on their mom, and then their dad panicked. He must have thought that the games would be loud enough that they wouldn't hear. Or maybe he had hoped that Janice wouldn't put up a fight at all. He had miscalculated, and before he knew it now he had a massacre on his hands. I walked up the steps, thinking how likely he had hunted his own children in this house. They must have been so frightened. I could see different places in the wall where they had stopped to catch their breath, or skirts in the rug where they had tried to hide. But their father was consumed with killing now. He was on a mission. Their begging and pleading wouldn't stop him. The little one probably went first, I thought, as I got to the top of the stairs. The severed heads I had seen in the garage haunted me again as I thought of how he had murdered them. It was beyond repulsive. Upstairs, I saw what looked like a hanging corpse. It was upside down from the rafters, with its head loose as well, and it looked like it was meant to deter visitors from entering the master suite. I ignored the prop and pushed through, desperate to see if I was right about what had transpired. But the room looked empty as well. Other than more Halloween decorations, it was another immaculate example of how Chris had gone so far to cover his tracks. What had he done with the rest of the body parts, though? I thought about the trash I had taken out and felt sick. He must have cut up all their bodies and planned to toss them out as well. I stood in a daze, realizing how far he had been willing to go. The poor children turned into shredded cheese just because of his lust for another woman. I couldn't help but vomit and shudder as I ran to the bathroom.
As I heaved and caught my breath over the toilet, I checked in there for more clues. He had to have used chemicals on Janice's body in the tub, like that Edgar Allan Poe story. What was it called? The Telltale Heart, where that sick bastard had dismembered the body in the tub. I smelled the essence of weird bleach. Dissolving her with acids, that would have been easy. But how had he gotten access to anything like that? Then I thought about my own shed. Had he broken in and taken my tools, the ones that were missing? Was he trying to frame me for this? I'm not sure why my brain jumped to that, but it instantly made me paranoid, and I swallowed hard. What did I do? I had already contacted the police. Should I file another report? But they hadn't listened to me the first time, so now it made me feel like I was going to be a troublemaker. What if I was wrong about all of this too? I needed more proof, I decided. I moved back into the hallway where the corpse was dangling from the ceiling and got a better look at it. My stomach dropped as it occurred to me this was no prop. It was Chris. I scrambled to find a way to cut him down, hoping to God he was still alive. It seemed unlikely, though. There was no way that anyone could be after a few minutes, let alone days. But still, I did my best to cut him down and tried to resuscitate him. His skin was blue, and his body was rigid. I felt sick, realizing that he had killed himself after finishing his family off. It was the only answer that made sense. Some part of me felt it was deserved, though, if my guess of how events played out was right. There was no way anyone with a conscience could live with themselves after killing their children, I thought. I took my smartphone out and got a few pictures, the proof I would need to show the police. Then I made my way out of there. It felt like the house was really haunted now that I knew of the reality of what had happened there, and I didn't want to spend another hour in it. Not even 1 minute. Back home, I tried to put the final pieces of the puzzle together in my brain. The only part that didn't make sense was Chris's lover. Surely she would have come looking for them. Or at least him. Where was she? I got some shut-eye and tried not to be mortified by the thought that maybe Chris had gone after her too. The next day I was rudely woken up by the sound of the police at my door. I didn't remember calling them, but I let them in anyway. What they told me has made me feel sick. They were there with a warrant to search my premises. One of my neighbors had reported suspicious activity in the area, the sounds of screaming. I nearly lost it, angered that they were taking these reports seriously instead of my own. But inwardly my stomach was twisting and turning. What if Chris had somehow planted evidence against me before he committed suicide? The officers combed my house and brought canine units in to sniff every nook and cranny. It didn't take long for them to find the trash bags, the ones I was sure that I had taken to the road, the ones filled with body parts. The shed was next. They found trace evidence that my fingerprints were all over the tools that were used to kill the family. I started to vomit, trying to find words that made sense. Of course my fingerprints would be there. They were my tools, for God's sake. I hardly knew what else to show them, so I insisted to the officers they needed to check out Chris's house. That was where the true crime had been committed after all. They questioned me for what felt like hours. I was literally sure I was going to the slammer for this perceived crime. It felt like my life was over. I was frightened, shaking like a leaf as I told them what I believed happened. This is just a misunderstanding. I pay my taxes. I donate to the city. These people are the ones that are sick," I stammered. I told them how this had started, and with the family obsession for Halloween. My mind started to play tricks on me again as I replayed the events. What if it had all been a massive stunt? What if none of it were real? I was losing my mind. The world was spinning. Were these even real cops? If so, they were going to toss me in a cell and throw away the key. But if not... I panicked as they kept writing their report and told them I needed to use the restroom. I went there to vomit and to think. There wasn't going to be any way out of this if it was for real. All the evidence pointed toward me. My palms were sweaty, and I started to convulse. There had to be a way out. I slammed my fist against the glass, causing shards to break in my hand. My fist was bloody now, but my hand was no longer shaking. In that moment, a new version of events played out in my head. One where I was the culprit. I'm not a people person. I hate my neighbors. Their decorations keep me up at all hours of the night. Halloween, Christmas, Thanksgiving. This year, I had hoped that the pandemic would stop them, but it seemed to spur them on, actually, even further. Had I gone over there to confront them, gotten into a heated argument and killed them all? No, it couldn't be. I didn't remember doing that. My reflection showed a twisted and dark smile, and it sent shivers down my spine. What was happening to me? I slammed at the glass again, trying to make it break entirely. The police managed to break the bathroom door down and pulled me away. The rest of the evening, it was a bit of a blur. They gave me something to calm my nerves and to get me start talking about the event, the reality of what had really happened over the past few days. My neighbors had been dead for a year now, they said, and another neighbor down the street had grown concerned for my well-being when it seemed that I had checked on them more frequently than I was wont, as though I thought they were still alive. They had no evidence to hold me because the trash bags that had the body parts in them didn't seem to hold any fingerprints, so it could have just as easily been someone else that had dropped them there. They had been sitting in my shed, sliced up and mutilated for a year now. They said the crime was still an ongoing investigation, and since they didn't have a warrant, they just had to bid me a good night, having finished their wellness check. And I started out toward the neighbor's house. It was abandoned, a crime scene from a year ago on Halloween, when I had grown tired of their screams and antics. And as I stared at their decorations, I saw their ghosts standing in the front lawn, glaring at me, pointing at me for their deaths. I now know how this Halloween will play out, because even if I didn't anticipate this nightmare, now I've become part of their celebration.
Was a Desirable Child by Dance Joe Dance 18.
A recent post by someone else about attempted kidnapping kinda jogged my memory again, so I figured I'd share my experience. Well, 2 experiences. The first part I really have no solid recollection of because I was so young, but it's been a story my mom has shared with family and friends over the years, so I've heard about it many times. This would have been the very early 90s, so I was probably 2 or 3. Definitely before cognitive memory, am I right? I don't really remember this specific trip, of course, but I do remember our routine of going grocery shopping, because my mom would always stop at Wendy's and get me chicken nuggets to eat in the cart. I will also mention that my mom worked nights at this same grocery store, the now defunct Pathmark chain. Anyways, as my mom was going about her business shopping, and I was going about my business tearing up some sweet nuggies, she was approached by an older woman. As I mentioned, my mom also worked here, and while she had countless regulars that would routinely come into the store, she never had seen this woman before. Now, I don't know if this woman was all there, but if she had evil intentions or not, she was just plain lonely, and when she stopped us, it was to ask my mom if she would sell me to her. By her account, my mom said that the woman was being dead serious, offering her $10,000 for me. First of all, I don't need to tell you that that's a terrible damn deal. I'm worth way more than that. Funny thing, come to think of it, am I worth any amount? Secondly, it was creepy as fuck and she was weird as shit. Obviously, my mom turned her down, told her off, and quickly got us the hell away from her. She rushed to the manager's office too to report what happened. Remember, early 90s, no cell phones. But by the time the security and the management went to find her, she was gone. I don't recall from the retelling of the story if the police were involved. I'll have to ask my mom to see if she still remembers, and I don't believe my mom ever saw her in the store again. So luckily, I wasn't tossed up on a register conveyor belt and scanned for $10,000. Unless she did sell me, and it turns out my mom isn't a real mom. Plot twist. My second experience was in the mid-90s. This one I do have some recollection of. My mom took me and my older brother to the mall because my brother was still a huge sports fan, and they were having a sports card show. If you are unfamiliar, a card show consists of a ton of vendors setting up tables throughout the mall, and they sell cards, autographs, jerseys, etc., anything sports related. Because of this, the mall was a lot more crowded than usual, and having the tables all set up sort of narrowed the general walking area. So lots of people were moving around through a tight space. This is an important detail. I also remember that it was around Halloween, because I vividly remember walking with my mom and brother past a Halloween adventure store. My brother had stopped and was looking at some Halloween cards and then later some sports cards. However, I was too distracted by the damn Halloween store because they had all the really awesome masks on this big wall that was visible from the outside of the store. Mistake number 1. I hadn't noticed it by this point, but my mom and brother had walked a little further down. Not far, but maybe 15 feet away from where we initially had stopped near the Halloween adventure. I guess I was still in my mask-gazing trance in the midst of this crowded and condensed walkway, when suddenly I felt a hand holding mine. Again, I was not really paying attention, at least to anything but the masks. Mistake number 2. So this hand was pulling me, rather briskly too, in the direction we had come from, which struck me as odd. Why we were going back the way we came when there was stuff that we hadn't seen yet perplexed me. This was the question I intended to ask my mom, finally, when raising my eyes to look at her. Yeah, not my mom. Instead, when I looked up, it turned out to be another woman that I'd never seen before. The creepy thing was that she never even looked once down at me. She was holding me by the hand, pulling me away from my mom at a fairly quick pace, and her gaze was just dead set in front of her, like this bizarre look of determination. This was what terrified me most and made me realize I had to break loose. Even more unsettling, as I was wiggling my hand free, her expression still didn't change. She still never looked down at me. And once I got my hand free, she did not react. She never spoke a single word. She didn't try to get me again either. She just kept walking at the same brisk pace as if nothing had changed. Everything about her was so robotic. I ran back to my mom and brother. Again, this wasn't that far away, and it all happened in a matter of seconds. But it doesn't take a few seconds to get scared shitless. I vaguely remember grabbing my mom and crying. At the time, I just said I was freaked out because I thought I had lost them. For whatever reason, though, I was afraid of getting in trouble, so I didn't bring up what happened until later. By that time, what can I really do? It's funny, though. You read all of these L&M stories, and it sort of has you recalling different unsettling events throughout your life, and maybe you remember things you had long forgotten. You read about stalking and harassment that goes on for years, and it makes you wonder if these experiences are random, or if, for whatever reason, they were all calculated. It's thoughts like this that force me to re-examine both of these events, and brought me to one terrifying question. What if it was the same woman?
Demons at Church Camp by DJ Peacock.
I am 26 years old, a male from a strong Christian family. I was raised in a non-denominational church background which never really focused on the idea of demons being present at all times, which is taught more heavily in other denominations, such as Catholicism. I had heard of them, of course, only some little jerks who danced around Satan to provide him company in hell. My experience started out just as another week at church camp during the summer before my 6th grade. This was one of those overnight camps that had all the trimmings, from horseback riding, paintball, water games, including the infamous blob, and massive campfires every night where we would sing church songs and bond with other groups each night. This was my 3rd year in a row coming to this camp, and as a soon-to-be middle school kid, we had the privilege of staying in the group cabins. In the previous years, I was constrained to what looked like a massive teepee or tent that could fit around 10 bunk beds. Those were the worst, as there was no protection from the plethora of insects I would find all over my bunk right before I fell asleep. This year, though, was different with the cabins. They had working lights, air conditioning units, and the bathrooms even had hot water in the showers. I remember thinking to myself around the 3rd or 4th day that I wanted to come back for the full summer the next year, as that was an option. What happened on the second to last night, though, changed my opinion, and really my life. There was nothing out of the ordinary about this night. It was just a regular summer night, and my group of around 15 to 20 5th and 6th graders had just finished our routine campfire and gone to bed. We never told ghost stories, as this was a Christian camp after all, like I said, so there was nothing for my mind to fear as I fell asleep. I remember the next moments as crystal clear as the day it happened, well over a decade ago. I don't know what woke me, but it wasn't a noise or the urge to go to the bathroom or anything like that. It was pitch black in the cabin, with barely the moonlight peeking through the curtains of the windows. I remember waving my hand in front of me and could just faintly make out the silhouette of my fingers. I was still very tired, and I knew I could drift back to sleep easily by closing my eyes again, but something made me glance over toward the door of the cabin. Beside the door, I saw what looked like the shadow of a man, probably around 6 feet tall, with no discernible features about him. He didn't move at all, but I could tell he was looking right at me, even though there was no face to look with. The shadow was darker than the already pitch-black room. I could literally see an outline of darkness against the wall, like a reversed flashlight. The funny thing is, I fell right back to sleep. I didn't freak out or anything. Heck, I didn't even give it more than a second of thought the next morning. I don't know if I hid that memory deep in my mind or if I truly couldn't comprehend what I had seen the night before. It wasn't until we were heading back to the cabin from the bathrooms the next night when I heard some kids outside the cabin next to us talking about a demon their counselor had seen the night before. I walked over and found the counselor, who was probably high school aged, and asked him to describe what happened. He started to tell me the exact situation that I had just encountered the night before, but his went a little different. He woke up and saw a shadow of a man, darker than the pitch black, staring at him with no discernible features, just like I had. He knew instantly, though, that this was a demon. He began to pray to God for protection and the expulsion of the demon from his cabin. During his prayer, he mentioned the name of Jesus, and then saw a surge of bright light appear, and the demon was gone. No one else in the cabin saw a thing. I lost it. I became inconsolable at the realization that I had just witnessed an actual demon the night before, but I never did anything to get rid of it. Every fear-driven question that could possibly be recreated was swimming in my head. Was it still around? Would I see it again that night? Could I get rid of it if I did see it? I just could not understand how a demon was in a church camp. I figured churches and places like this were sacred ground. How could a demon find its way in? My counselors were very understanding of my distressed state and did everything they could to make me feel better. My counselor kept the bunk below mine, and I called his name to check if he was awake every 15 minutes that night. Neither of us slept, but I felt that it was better than waking up face to face, alone with a demon. I made it home fine the following day and never told my parents about that situation, as I knew they would probably think it was just my overactive imagination. I have done research as I've grown older and found that if anything, churches and church events are more prone to demon encounters. Demons want to do anything to prevent you from getting closer with God, so I'm assuming that since I was young, an impressionable child who was still figuring out things with religion, I was a prime target. I've found that I've grown stronger in faith due to the encounter. I still wake up in the middle of the night, though, and think that I might glance toward the door of my room to see that same dark shadow. But I feel more prepared now if I do.
I'm a werewolf, and I'm afraid of my human girlfriend. By Videezy.
I think I wanted it at first. Being a werewolf was such a chaotic, wild experience. Constantly hanging on the edge of control, staring into the chasm of instinct and impulse, seeing how long I could teeter on the border of sanity. Melissa represented caution, discipline, and control. It had been like a sigh of relief, a release from responsibility, to be on a metaphorical leash. She grounded me, policed me, made sure I kept my nose clean. It started out self-imposed. I chose to stay in for the nights, chose to stay human. I couldn't let her find out about my condition, and on top of that, she was the perfect excuse to get me out of the weekly, if not nightly, hunts my pack always dragged me along for. After a while, though, I'm not sure exactly when, it stopped being self-imposed. After holding back from my carnal nature for a period of time, I began to crave it. But every time I decided to leave, my heart would start pounding. I'd start looking over my shoulder as I got ready, feeling guilty and, for some reason, apprehensive. These feelings strong enough to dissuade me from leaving. I remember the first time I saw Melissa standing in the threshold between the dining room and the kitchen, her hands on her hips, her eyes dull and calculating. My hand was on the doorknob, and she regarded me, frozen in that position, like an alpha would a pup who had taken more than his fair share of the kill.
"Where are you going?"
she asked. I swallowed, my mind searching for an explanation. I couldn't tell her I was a werewolf going to run with the pack.
You're not leaving for the night, are you?"
she said as her head leaned to one side critically. It was a question, but it wasn't a question. I turned my head to the side, my heart beating heavily in my chest. For a moment, indignation rose in me. I was a werewolf, a terrifying beast of the night. How dare this mere human instill such fear in me? My eyes happened to glance out of the window, and I saw the empty trash bin still sitting down at the end of the driveway. Relief flooded through me, and before I could think about what I was saying, I spoke.
"Of course not. I just happened to see the trash cans out there. Forgot to bring them in earlier, so I figured I'd run out and grab them now."
At that, Melissa's thin line of a mouth curled into a smile and she nodded. My quest for the trash cans had been approved. I turned away from her and opened the door, and that's when she said it, quietly but loud enough for me to hear.
"Good boy."
The hair on my arms stood up, and I paused in the doorway. My breaths became heavier, and thoughts and emotions raced through me, but I shoved all the implications aside. The trash needed to be brought in. That was a few weeks ago, and now the leash felt more like a noose. Every rebellious thought I had, every time I tried to pull away, I felt this closing grip around my throat, as pulling away only tightened the knot. Eventually, however, the need to leave, to run and to hunt was left so long unsated, it grew to match the feelings that held it back. Over the course of a few days, I built up the courage to confront Melissa, and on the night I'd told my pack I would join them, I approached her. I opened the door to the basement, and the rattling sound of the washing machine bounced up the stairwell to my ears. I swallowed and descended. The basement was unfinished, and Melissa stood on the concrete floor in front of the washer and dryer, two shining white pieces of machinery in an otherwise gray and brown basement. A single incandescent light bulb with a pull string hung over Melissa's head like a one-dimensional halo, casting hard shadows about the room. I reached the bottom of the stairs and waited. She was finishing up setting the dryer to run, and I didn't want to interrupt her. Finally, the dryer hummed to life, joining the running washing machine in a chorus of mechanical grumbles and clicks. Melissa heaved a basket of clean laundry up to rest on her hip, and she turned.
"Oh, Terry, did you need something?"
My voice caught in my throat, and I stared at her dumbly for a few minutes. Her eyes narrowed at me, and a shiver ran down my spine.
"Something the matter, Terry?"
she asked. I cleared my throat and steeled myself.
Some of my friends are going out for the night, and
I'd like to... I stopped as the noose tightened. Melissa's face hadn't changed, but somehow it had. Her gaze burned into me. I could almost feel my skin peeling and curling from the heat. My eyes fell away from hers and settled on the basket weighing heavily on her hip. I took a step forwards and reached out my arms toward the laundry. Here, let me take that. I can carry it upstairs, so... My voice trailed off as Melissa made no movement to allow me to take custody of the laundry basket. She just held her piercing gaze on me.
Some friends of yours are going out for the night, and you'd like to...
She echoed, using my exact tone until she curled the end of it into a question. My head dipped submissively, but I pressed on. I'd like to... I swallowed and furrowed my brow. No, my words would not be a question or a request. I raised my head to meet her gaze.
I'm going to head out with the... And you're telling me this at 9:30 at night?
She asked sharply. My gut twisted.
Well, I didn't mean to wait so long. I just... time got away from me. Here, let me take that laundry basket. I didn't think we had anything planned for this evening, so I didn't think about mentioning it until... now.
I rattled off as I reached again for the basket hanging at her hip. Again, she made no move to hand it to me.
Upstairs,
she stated, her voice terrifyingly devoid of emotion. My entire body tensed up. I didn't move. Melissa stepped around me and started up the stairs, her footstep heavy with the weight of the laundry she lugged along. I listened to her ascend, but I heard her stop at the top. The floor creaked as she turned around to regard me.
Come.
My feet moved without thinking. My head stayed down. I traipsed up the stairs behind her and followed her as she walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. She set the basket down in front of her and then patted the seat beside her. I moved to it and sat.
Help me fold this laundry. Since you've been staying here, I've got double the amount I usually do. After this, I've got 2 more loads coming, though,
she told me. My voice came out quietly.
Last time I tried to help you you told me I was folding things the wrong way. And now you know the right way,
she stated cheerfully. I felt a heat begin to rise in my chest.
You just want me to help you so I can't go out.
Silence hung in the room like fog. Melissa said nothing, so I stood up.
Down,
she ordered. My body almost listened instinctively, and that made me angry. I let out a snarl and faced her, my heart pounding in my chest.
You do not order me around like that. I will tolerate it no longer.
Melissa turned her icy cold glare to me, and it took everything I had not to falter.
I said, down,
she repeated. My lips peeled back in a furious grimace, baring my teeth.
Who do you think you are?
Melissa's lips twitched, and then her mouth creased into a frown.
Don't push it,
she warned me. I laughed, incredulous.
Don't push it? You've been pushing me around for weeks. I'm going out tonight whether you like it or not.
I stormed off toward the front door.
Terry, stay,
Melissa barked. I felt compulsion grip my chest, but it only infuriated me more. Something in me snapped, and a burning sensation spread through my entire body. I was going to change. I could not stop it, and I was fine with that. I hunched over as my bones and muscles twisted and snapped and grew. I felt my face stretch into a pointed snout, and hair crawled up through every inch of my skin. My teeth grew, my canines sharpened, my clothes ripped and parted into shreds. I let out a deep, guttural growl and spun to face Melissa. I would see such fear in her eyes. I would see in her the same apprehension she instilled in me. I reveled in the thought of her shrinking away, terrified of my true form. But the woman was doing no such thing. Slowly, she rose and stepped away from the couch, regarding me with something like disappointment and perhaps a bit of pity. Rage overtook me, and I lunged at her with a snarl. Melissa stood her ground, and I stopped an inch away from her face. There was no fear, no apprehension, no sense of mortal danger from her. I was several feet taller than her in my true form, and yet somehow she looked down on me. Her shape didn't change, but in my head she grew. She grew bigger than me, and she was stronger than me. That's what her eyes said. That's what her posture told me, and I could not bring myself to argue. "Sit," she commanded, her face twitching into a moment of grimace as she spoke. My jaw snapped shut, and I fell to my hindquarters. Melissa's hand curled into a fist, save her index finger, which she pointed to the ground. "Lay down." Defeated, I let out a slight whimper as I willingly collapsed to the floor, placing my chin on the ground at her feet. "Now stay," she bid me, a hint of irresistible softness entering her voice. I stayed there for a few moments, and she did nothing but breathe. Melissa slowly lowered herself into a squat, and her hand rested upon my head. Her knuckles curled, and she scratched through the fur between my ears. "Good boy," she cooed quietly. I felt my body relax, and a euphoric sensation spread through every inch of my being. And I had never been more afraid.
The Witch on the Window.
Do you believe in ghosts? There are moments in my life where I have been asked this question, and every time I would answer, I'm not sure. I cannot easily reject it though, because I know you cannot deny something that cannot be seen by the naked eye alone. But accepting the possibility of an unknown and unseen being hovering near me at any place and any time is quite unsettling. Though my acceptance of this particular issue is vague, my younger sister, on the other hand, is a different matter. Ever since she was young, she would always claim to see things that people didn't normally see. My father used to tell me that when they were both driving along the federal highway, they came across a huge pileup and an ambulance near it. My father described the scene as horrific. The cars were twisted and bent out of proportion. His first thought was that there was no way anyone could survive that. As they drove past, my sister looked and said, "Why is that man standing with his clothes all red and dirty?" My father, eyes still focused on the road, was astonished by that person's luck and said to my sister that he was probably hurt bad by the accident. When they arrived home, my father told our family of the incident and urged us to watch the evening news that would probably cover it. And as the news unfolded, the faces of the people involved in the accident were displayed on the screen, my sister tugging at my father's shirt and pointing up to the face of one of the victims. "Dad, that's the man I saw. What happened to him?" My father's face went pale. The faces shown were the people who died in the accident. All of them had died on the spot. I was curious, to say the least. I'm sure she wouldn't lie, but as I was not there when it took place, I couldn't reach a definitive conclusion regarding the matter. As time went on, as most things in life do, the memory faded away from me, the thought not resurfacing itself in my head until years later. My family moved into a new house a while ago.
It was a 2-story bungalow with a large tree next to it. It looked like any typical house, really. As a day of rigorous unpacking ended, we all went to our respective rooms. My sister was conveniently located near the tree outside the 2nd floor, where it could be seen through the room's window. I'm not sure if it was past midnight or before, but the silence of our house that night was broken by the screams of my sister. I rushed into her room, my parents arriving later. She was sobbing uncontrollably, tightly embracing my mother. I was about to ask when I realized that this was probably related to her sensitive perception. I kept my mouth shut and quietly went back to my room. I probably would get the clear answer tomorrow anyway. As I anticipated, my sister told her story the next day during breakfast. She claimed that when she was about to fall asleep, she felt a cold breeze coming from the window. She went to close it and then saw a figure crouching on the tree's branches, that of an old woman, hair as white as the moon itself, with claws of 3 on each hand, smiling and looking at her with crimson red eyes. I found her description at the time quite over the top, like something out of a stereotypical horror movie or something. I pushed aside my thoughts when she expressed her desire to change rooms. My father, who was quite thorough at the time, nodded and asked who would volunteer to exchange rooms with my sister. I gazed at my other siblings, their eyes facing the ground, showing their reluctance, maybe fear. I glanced back at my sister to see her dejected face, although I found the whole thing quite absurd, seeing the pained expression on my sister making up my mind quite quickly. I volunteered, my sister beaming with delight, expressing her gratitude over and over. "Please," I nonchalantly nodded, not giving much thought to her words. Fate probably had disagreements regarding my attitude. That night, after relocating my stuff to my new room, I went to my desk to prepare the report for my upcoming presentation. I sat there for what may be an hour when I felt a cold breeze from behind. I glanced behind to see the window had opened slightly. At first I paid no heed to it, with the thought that I had probably not properly closed it. But then I felt the urge to go back and have a look at that window, to confirm for myself of what my sister had seen. I took slow, steady steps toward the window, the sound of crickets outside matching the beating of my heart, and with feelings of uncertainty looked outside toward the tree. There was nothing there. Like an anticlimactic moment in a horror movie, I felt somewhat disappointed, but also somewhat relieved. It was then that I felt quite stupid regarding the whole matter. I chuckled slightly, my thoughts that the possibility of someone or something to be dangling outside of a tree of my room to be absurd, and with a confident tone I said, "Hey, if you're really out there, why don't you show up in my face?" As those words left my lips, the sounds of the crickets outside and the breeze that blew by just died, leaving behind an eerie silence of nothingness. I stood there frozen in place. I didn't know what to make of the situation. My imagination was getting the best of me, and I could almost swear that the branches were swaying on their own without any aid from the wind, as if the tree itself was coming to life. Ridiculous as it sounds, I even started hearing things, whispers to be exact, of what topic I'm not sure. Given the nature of the circumstance, I wouldn't be surprised if it was an issue best discussed only in hell. And to add it all up, images of white-haired women lunging at me kept popping inside my head. The whispers and images began to intensify to my horror, trying to push me over the edge of my own sanity. Suddenly a knock came upon my door, purging my senses from those abominations. "Bro, are you awake?" my sister said on the other side of the door. The whispering, moving branches, those horrid images in my mind had all stopped. I bent my knees, trying to catch my breath. I felt the wind had been struck out of me. I wiped away the sweat from my brow, seeing the small puddle of perspiration soaking on the wooden floor beneath me. A second knock came upon my door.
Bro, are you listening? Are you all right?
I could feel the urgency in her voice.
Yeah, I'm all right. My mind just wandered a bit. Anything you need, sis?
I tried to maintain my composure as best I could.
Just checking up on you,
she spoke softly, out of relief perhaps. After a few moments in silence, she said again,
I'm worried about you, bro.
Nothing to worry about, sis,
I almost stammered.
You should go to bed. It's getting late, and I'm thinking of going to sleep now myself.
Okay.
She seemed hesitant in her reply, but then I heard her footsteps moving away from my door. As her footsteps faded away, I gathered my thoughts, trying to make sense of the whole matter. Was I imagining things? Did I become so paranoid? I let my imagination get the best of me? My eyes darted to the clock hanging on my wall. 2 a.m. I've been standing now by the window for hours. Slowly my gaze shifted toward the window in front of me, and with all the resolve I still have, I picked myself up and looked through the window. There was nothing there. I must be tired, I thought to myself. I closed the window, went back to bed, and hoped for a good night's rest. I woke up the next day feeling somewhat groggy. As the cobwebs cleared, I sat on my bed and tried to make sense of the event that occurred last night. Reaching no conclusion, I decided to consult my sister later. I got up from bed then and went to the bathroom to take a quick morning shower. As I drenched myself under the shower water, I suddenly felt a stinging sensation in my back. The pain was so terrible that I almost fell to the floor. I got out of the shower and went in front of the mirror, with my back facing it, trying to see if there were any cuts. To my horror, the reflection showed that there were 6 long scratch marks on my back. 3 were on the left side, and the other 3 were on the right side. I never told my family, especially my sister. I don't want to upset them. I tried telling myself to believe that I caused those scratches on my back when I was asleep. Some days I didn't even believe it. To my relief, for the few months that my family stayed there before we moved away for unrelated and trivial reasons, that was the last time something like that occurred. As sudden as it happened, there was no longer any similar occurrences happening, leaving behind a deeply imprinted memory in me. As I come to the conclusion of this story, I try to reflect also on what happened, trying to make sense of all this. Though regarding this matter, nothing is certain, I suppose.
Don't go into the woods this Halloween by Striker the Gecko.
You know that lecture your parents give you every year on October 31st? You know the one. Don't go into strangers' houses. Don't eat opened candy. Don't go into someone's car. Don't leave the street. You probably rolled your eyes or swore under your breath, but it is good advice. Unfortunately, last year, I didn't follow the rules, and now you and everybody is in danger. Now, let me explain. It all started last year on Halloween night. Halloween, if you don't know, is my favorite holiday. I love a good scare. So, me and my friends, David, Kyle, and Tom, we were 14, so trick-or-treating wasn't exciting enough anymore. Kyle wanted to go to Hannah Jenner's party, but her parents asked some neighbors to watch the party and make sure things didn't get out of hand. So it was boring, and we left after a few minutes. We started walking down the street, hoping for something to do. We decided we could go to Tom's house and play some video games. But now it was about 11:15 at night. When we got to Tom's street, we noticed a car pull up next to his house. David's older brother and some of his friends got out of the car. "What are you doing down here, Jaden?" David asked. "Having some fun," Jaden replied. Jaden's friend took something out of the car. It was a carton of eggs. They started to throw eggs at the house. Then they started egging Tom's house too. Tom demanded they stop, but that just made them do it more. Tom, of course, got mad and started chasing Jaden and his friends. The rest of us began chasing them too. We chased them for a few minutes, and they ran into what I think was the backyard of one of Jaden's friends. The backyard was next to the woods. Jaden ran into the woods, and his friends followed. We kept chasing them. We ran through the woods. We eventually lost them in the dark. "What do we do now?" Kyle asked. "Let's hang out here," Tom said. "Let's not," David whispered. "This place is creepy." "Oh, don't be such a scaredy cat," Tom taunted. "We can use our phone flashlights so we can see." David looked at me, a pleading look on his eyes. I just shrugged. David was a year younger than us and much smarter. He probably knew how dumb this was, but we convinced him to stay. We started joking and laughing as we walked through the woods. We were talking about school when we saw a faint light in the distance. As we got closer, we saw that it was a campfire. We were confused, as this wasn't a campground, and there were no tents or people nearby. We got even closer. We saw a piece of paper lying near the fire. It was simply an arrow pointing due north. That's when we noticed a trail. We decided to follow it. After about 2 minutes of walking, we found something. At the end of the trail was an old, seemingly abandoned house. "I don't like this," David whispered. But we kept on going and walked inside. To this day, I don't understand why we did that. When we entered the house, we saw 2 staircases, one going up and the other down. On the staircase leading to the basement, there was an arrow pointing downward, leading into it. "Let's leave now," David yelled. "Yeah, this is stupid," I replied. That's when we heard the door slam shut. Kyle tried to open it, but it was locked. Tom went upstairs to find a window. Nobody wanted to go downstairs. But after not finding anything, Tom walked downstairs after a few seconds. "No windows," Tom said. "What do you mean?" David was panicking now. "There has to be windows, right?" "I don't know what to tell you, but there's nothing here," Tom yelled. Kyle tried to calm us down, but David was screaming for help and crying and screaming that we were going to die. David's fears made us all scared, and we began yelling too for help. That's when we heard the sound of footsteps walking down the staircase, leading to the top floor. It was coming right towards us. We ran downstairs. When we got there, we found a large room with candles lit and a book on a small empty desk. However, on the floor was horrifying. There were 3 corpses lying there. It was Jaden and 2 of his friends. Tom began screaming. That's when the door on the other side of the room opened. It was an old woman of all people. She smiled and told us to sit down. Oddly, there were chairs near the middle of the room for all of us. We decided to listen and sat down.
The woman began to speak.
I love it when I have visitors.
Her voice was weak and raspy.
Please enjoy your stay. Oh, I almost forgot. Rufus, come down, boy.
Rufus walked down the stairs, but it wasn't a dog. It was a large man with extremely long hair over his shoulders. He didn't speak. He just grunted.
Please let me read you a story. My visitors always love a good story.
She walked to the desk where the candles were and picked up the book that was lying on it. She began to read from it.
If you wish to summon Dagdramak, the spirit of All Hallows Eve, then you must find 6 people and sacrifice them to the great Dagdramak. You must do this every Hallowed Eve for 13 years, and then Dagdramak will rise.
She looked at us and smiled.
This is my 12th year, friends. I'm sorry you have to go soon, but I must summon Dagdramak.
Rufus threw Kyle to the ground and then tied the rest of us to our chairs. He grabbed Kyle. The old woman began to chant something, but I couldn't make out what she said. We watched in horror as Rufus killed Kyle. He threw the corpse into the pile. We all screamed as Rufus grabbed Tom then, and the woman recited the chant. Rufus killed Tom. The same happened to David. After that, the woman looked at me and frowned. She had gotten 6 people, and I don't think she could go over.
Listen to me now, boy.
The woman yelled in a surprisingly deep voice.
If you tell anyone about this, you will die. You hear me?
Okay, I said. I was still terrified. That's when I passed out. I woke up in the backyard that bordered the woods. I walked to the street, and that's when a police car happened to drive up next to me. He told me that my parents had been looking for me for hours and asked me what happened. I began to tell him, but I felt lightheaded and fainted again. I awoke in a hospital room. I had passed out and gotten a concussion. I was questioned by the police and by my parents about what happened, but I just told them I didn't know. I was too afraid of what would happen if I told them. However, last week, I found a way to cheat the spell. It doesn't work if I write or type what had happened. I'm telling you this to warn you. Do not enter the woods this Halloween. If you do, then that witch will summon Dagdramak again. I don't know what will happen if he is summoned, but I don't want to find out.